It was just an ordinary day, like any other. The bus was making its usual rounds, picking up passengers as people carried on with their daily routines. Some were staring out the windows, lost in thought, while others were scrolling through their phones or chatting quietly. The hum of the engine and the rhythmic stops had everyone lulled into the predictable flow of the ride, until something completely unexpected happened. At one of the stops, the bus came to a screeching halt, but no one was waiting to get on. Instead, there stood a dog. Not just any dog. It was frantic, barking, and pacing back and forth as if it was trying to grab everyone's attention. At first, the driver hesitated, unsure of what to make of the situation. The passengers, too, sat frozen in a mix of confusion and curiosity. This wasn't just an ordinary stray dog wandering around. No, this dog had a sense of urgency, a purpose. It wasn't just barking aimlessly, it was pleading, almost as if it was begging for help. The energy shifted in an instant, and what started as a regular day turned into something far more unusual. What could a dog possibly need from a bus full of strangers? Little did anyone know, this was only the beginning of a story that would leave everyone speechless. The bus had just pulled up to the next stop, its brakes hissing as it came to a standstill. But instead of the usual sight of a waiting passenger or someone casually waving it down, there was something far more unexpected. Standing in front of the bus was a dog. No leash, no owner in sight, just this lone dog, staring directly at the vehicle. At first, it didn't seem like much. Maybe the dog had wandered onto the road by accident. But then it began barking, a sharp, urgent sound that cut through the quiet hum of the bus. The dog wasn't acting like a typical stray. It was pacing back and forth, its tail stiff, its movements frantic. It would glance up at the driver, then back down the street and bark again, almost as if it was trying to say something. Inside the bus, the passengers started to take notice. Conversations halted, phones were lowered, and all eyes turned toward the strange scene unfolding outside. Some people whispered to each other, speculating. "What's wrong with that dog?" someone murmured. Others looked concerned, while a few rolled their eyes, assuming it was just another stray causing trouble. The driver, an older man with years of experience on this route, sat gripping the steering wheel, unsure of what to do. He squinted through the windshield, watching the dog intently. It wasn't running away or acting aimless. Its behavior was deliberate. The way it barked, the way it moved. There was no mistaking it. This dog needed something. For a moment, the driver hesitated. After all, he had a schedule to keep. Stopping for a stray animal wasn't exactly part of the job. But then, as if sensing the hesitation, the dog stepped closer to the bus, barking even louder. Its eyes were locked onto the driver, filled with a mixture of desperation and determination. It wasn't just standing there, it was asking for help. The tension inside the bus grew. A young woman near the front leaned forward in her seat. "Do you think it's hurt?" she asked, her voice tinged with worry. An older man sitting in the back shook his head. "It doesn't look hurt. It's trying to get us to follow it," he said, almost as if he understood the dog's intent. The driver finally exhaled, his decision made. He opened the door slightly, just enough to get a better look at the dog. As soon as the door hissed open, the dog's barking stopped. It stood still for a moment, staring up at the driver with wide, pleading eyes. Then it took a few steps backward, looked over its shoulder, and barked again, this time as if to say, "Come with me." The driver turned to the passengers, a mixture of concern and resolve on his face. "I think we need to see what this dog wants," he said, his voice firm but unsure. Some passengers nodded in agreement, their curiosity now fully piqued. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly torn between fascination and impatience. The dog took a few more steps away from the bus, stopping to look back and make sure it was being followed. Its urgency was palpable, and now even the skeptics on the bus were starting to feel the weight of the moment. Whatever this dog was leading them to, it wasn't random. Something was happening, and everyone on the bus was about to be a part of it. The driver eased the bus back into gear, the engine rumbling as it crept forward slowly. The dog started moving, leading the way down the street, its tail high and its pace brisk. Passengers pressed their faces to the windows, watching intently as the dog guided the bus through the neighborhood. Some held their breath, their hearts racing with anticipation, while others whispered theories about what they might find. What could this dog be trying to show them? A lost owner? An emergency? The questions hung in the air, unanswered, as the bus followed the determined animal into the unknown. This was no ordinary ride, and everyone on board could feel it. The bus rolled forward slowly, inching along as the driver kept his eyes on the dog. The passengers sat in tense silence, their curiosity growing with every step the dog took. Its pace was quick and deliberate, looking back over its shoulder every few seconds to make sure the bus was following. Each time the driver hesitated or slowed down, the dog stopped, turned around, and barked again, louder and more urgent. It was as if the dog was saying, "Hurry! There's no time to waste!" The driver tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his mind racing. This wasn't a decision he could take lightly. What if the dog was leading them nowhere? What if it was just a stray acting strangely? The schedule was already slipping behind, and he had a bus full of people to think about. But then he glanced back at the passengers through the rearview mirror. Most of them were glued to the windows, their eyes wide with anticipation. A young woman had her hands clasped together, as though silently willing the dog to reveal its purpose. An older man had leaned forward in his seat, watching the unfolding scene with a look of quiet intensity. Even the usually indifferent commuters seemed captivated by the dog's persistence. It was as though the whole bus had been swept up in the mystery. Still, the driver hesitated. What if he was wrong to follow this dog? What if it led them into trouble, or worse, turned out to be nothing at all? He tapped his fingers on the steering wheel, wrestling with his decision. But every time he looked back at the dog, something about its eyes stopped him in his tracks. Those eyes, they weren't wild or aimless. They were filled with purpose, almost human-like in their desperation. This dog wasn't playing a game. It needed help. The dog barked again, snapping him out of his thoughts. It had stopped in the middle of the road, turning to face the bus as if to say, "What are you waiting for?" Behind him, a passenger's voice broke the silence. "We have to follow it," the young woman said, her tone resolute. "It's trying to tell us something." Another passenger chimed in, this time an older man with a deep, steady voice. "I've heard stories like this before. Dogs don't act like that for no reason. There's something going on." The driver sighed, glancing back at the dog one more time. It was standing still now, its body tense, its eyes locked on the bus. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. If he followed the dog and it led to nothing, he'd have wasted time and upset his passengers. But if he ignored it, what if something terrible happened because he chose to look the other way? Finally, he made his choice. With a determined nod, he reached for the intercom. "Folks," he said, his voice firm but slightly unsure. "I don't know where this dog is taking us, but I think we need to find out. If anyone needs to get off, I understand. Otherwise, we're following it." The passengers exchanged glances, a mixture of excitement and apprehension on their faces. No one moved to leave. Instead, they all seemed to brace themselves, as though they were about to embark on a journey none of them could predict. The driver eased the bus forward again, his heart pounding as he followed the dog's lead. The animal darted ahead, guiding the bus down streets and around corners with the same urgency as before. The suspense in the air was almost unbearable. Where was this dog taking them? What could possibly be waiting at the end of this strange and unexpected journey? The dog suddenly picked up speed, breaking into a full run. The driver's pulse quickened, and he pressed lightly on the gas to keep up. The passengers leaned forward in their seats, their eyes glued to the windows. Every corner they turned, every street they passed, only added to the mystery. The dog's determination was undeniable, and with every second the stakes felt higher. Then, just as quickly as it had started running, the dog slowed down. It turned sharply onto a narrow, quiet street, its movements more focused than ever. The driver's chest tightened as the bus crept after it. The dog stopped in front of a driveway, barking wildly. The sound echoed through the street, sharp and urgent, as though this was the moment it had been waiting for. The driver brought the bus to a halt, his hands trembling slightly as he put it in park. The passengers sat frozen, their breaths caught in their throats. The dog stood at the edge of the driveway, barking and pacing with an intensity that sent chills through everyone watching. Whatever this dog was trying to show them, they were about to find out, and none of them could shake the feeling that their lives were about to change forever. The bus moved slowly down the narrow street, the engine's low rumble almost drowned out by the rhythmic barking of the dog leading the way. Its movements were swift and deliberate, a stark contrast to the tense, hushed atmosphere inside the bus. Passengers clutched the edges of their seats, their eyes glued to the windows as the dog darted ahead, occasionally glancing back to ensure the bus was still following. The driver's hands gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles white with tension. Every few moments he'd glance at the dog, then at the rearview mirror to gauge the passengers' reactions. Their faces mirrored his own, wary, curious, and filled with anticipation. No one spoke now. The silence was heavy, punctuated only by the dog's insistent barking and the occasional creak of the bus as it rolled over uneven pavement. The dog suddenly veered to the left, sprinting down a side street. The driver hesitated for a split second before turning the wheel to follow. The street was narrower here, lined with quiet houses and dimly lit by streetlights. Shadows stretched long across the pavement, adding an eerie quality to the unfolding scene. It felt like they were being pulled into another world, one where logic and routine had no place. Inside the bus, the passengers began whispering among themselves, unable to contain their mounting curiosity. "What could it be?" a young woman murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe it's hurt, or it's trying to lead us to someone in trouble," another replied, her tone tinged with unease. In the back, an older man shook his head solemnly. "Whatever it is, that dog knows exactly where it's going," he said, his voice carrying a strange mix of confidence and dread. The bus picked up speed as the dog broke into a full sprint. Its tail was high, its body taut with urgency. The driver's heartbeat quickened as he pressed the gas pedal, keeping the bus close behind. The dog darted around corners and across intersections, never once hesitating. Every turn seemed to lead them deeper into the unknown, the once familiar neighborhood now feeling like uncharted territory. Suddenly, the dog paused at a fork in the road, turning back to face the bus. It barked sharply, as if urging them to keep up, before sprinting down the left path. The driver didn't hesitate this time. He followed, his focus solely on the animal. The passengers leaned forward, their eyes wide as they tried to anticipate what lay ahead. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut, and every second felt stretched to its breaking point. As the bus followed the dog, the streets began to change. The rows of houses gave way to open lots and overgrown patches of grass. The streetlights grew sparser, casting long, flickering shadows that danced across the pavement. The atmosphere grew heavier, an almost tangible sense of foreboding settling over everyone on board. "Where is this dog taking us?" someone finally asked, their voice breaking the oppressive silence. The dog suddenly slowed its pace, trotting carefully now as if nearing its destination. It glanced back at the bus once more, its eyes reflecting the dim glow of the headlights. There was something almost human in its gaze, a mixture of urgency and determination that sent chills down the driver's spine. Then, without warning, the dog stopped. It stood in the middle of the road, barking loudly and persistently, its body angled towards something just out of sight. The driver squinted, trying to make out what the dog was pointing them toward. The passengers craned their necks, pressing their faces against the windows, desperate to see what was ahead. The dog barked again, more urgently this time, then darted off to the right, disappearing behind a cluster of trees. The bus came to a screeching halt, and for a moment, everything was still. The driver hesitated, his hand hovering over the gear shift, unsure of what to do next. The passengers held their breath, their eyes fixed on the spot where the dog had vanished. The seconds felt like hours as they waited, the suspense building with every passing moment. Then, from behind the trees, the dog reappeared. It barked furiously, its movements frantic as it tried to pull their attention towards something hidden in the shadows. It wasn't just leading them anymore, it was demanding they follow. The driver exchanged a glance with the passengers closest to him, their expressions mirroring his own mixture of fear and resolve. He knew there was no turning back now. Whatever this dog had brought them here to see, it wasn't something they could ignore. Slowly, he put the bus back into gear and turned toward the trees, following the dog into the darkness. The bus crept forward, its headlights slicing through the gloom. The dog led them off the road and onto a dirt path, its barking echoing eerily in the still night air. The passengers gripped their seats tightly, their breaths shallow as they prepared for what was to come. Every bump in the path, every rustle of the trees, felt amplified, heightening the tension to almost unbearable levels. And then, the dog stopped again. This time, it didn't bark. It stood perfectly still, its body rigid as it stared straight ahead. The bus came to a halt behind it, the engine idling softly. No one moved, no one spoke. All eyes were on the dog and whatever lay beyond it, hidden in the darkness. The suspense was suffocating. Something was waiting for them, something the dog had fought so desperately to show them. And in that moment, as the passengers and the driver sat frozen in their seats, they all knew their lives were about to change forever. The bus came to a slow, creaking stop, its headlights illuminating the path ahead. The dog stood motionless now, its body tense and its eyes fixed on something just beyond the beam of light. The barking had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to stretch across the entire scene. Inside the bus, the tension was palpable. The passengers sat frozen, their breaths shallow as they stared out the windows, trying to make sense of what was happening. The driver hesitated for a moment, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for the door control. With a soft hiss, the bus door opened and the cool night air rushed in. The dog immediately perked up, turning to look at the driver as if urging him to hurry. It barked once, a sharp, commanding sound, before darting forward into the shadows. The driver stepped down cautiously, his boots crunching against the gravel road. A few passengers, too curious to stay behind, followed him off the bus, their footsteps hesitant. They clustered together near the front of the bus, their eyes darting between the dog and the darkness ahead. The dog barked again, pacing anxiously in place before running a few steps further and stopping to look back. It was clear, it wanted them to follow. The driver, feeling the weight of the moment, took a deep breath and motioned for the others to stay close. Slowly, they began to follow the dog down the path, their footsteps echoing in the stillness of the night. The dirt road was uneven, lined with tall grass and trees that loomed overhead, their branches casting long, spindly shadows. Every rustle of the leaves seemed amplified, and the air was thick with anticipation. Then, they saw it. Just a few yards ahead, illuminated by the weak glow of the bus's headlights, was an overturned bicycle lying in the middle of the path. The driver's heart sank as he quickened his pace, the dog now circling the bicycle, barking furiously. As they got closer, the passengers gasped in unison. Next to the bicycle, partially obscured by the tall grass, was a figure, small, motionless, and eerily silent. The driver rushed forward, his pulse racing. It was a young boy, no older than 8 or 9. He was lying on his side, his face pale and streaked with dirt. One of his legs was trapped awkwardly under the twisted metal of the bicycle frame. His chest rose and fell faintly, proof that he was still breathing, but his condition was alarming. The boy's clothes were torn, and there were scratches along his arms and face, likely from his fall. The dog barked again, standing protectively by the boy's side, its eyes darting between the group and the child as if to say, "Help him, please!" The driver dropped to his knees beside the boy, checking for signs of responsiveness. "Hey, kid," he said softly, his voice trembling. "Can you hear me?" The boy stirred slightly, letting out a faint whimper. His eyelids fluttered open for a moment before closing again. The passengers exchanged worried looks, their earlier curiosity now replaced with deep concern. One of the women, a nurse who happened to be on board, stepped forward and knelt beside the driver. "Let me take a look," she said firmly, her professional instincts kicking in. The nurse carefully examined the boy, checking his pulse and gently inspecting his injuries. "He's dehydrated, and he's been out here for a while," she said, her voice steady but urgent. "We need to call for an ambulance." The driver nodded and quickly pulled out his phone, dialing emergency services while the passengers hovered nearby, their expressions a mix of fear and admiration for the dog. As the call was made, the dog sat down beside the boy, its tail wagging slightly now that help had arrived. Its eyes never left the child, a quiet determination still present in its gaze. It was clear that the dog had been protecting him, staying by his side until someone could come to help. While waiting for the ambulance, the nurse and a few passengers did their best to make the boy comfortable. One man took off his jacket and draped it over the child to keep him warm. Another woman handed the driver a bottle of water, which they used to gently wet the boy's lips. The dog remained close, watching every move with unwavering focus. Minutes felt like hours, but finally, the distant wail of sirens broke through the still night. The ambulance pulled up, its flashing lights casting an eerie glow over the scene. Paramedics rushed out, assessing the boy's condition and preparing him for transport. The passengers stepped back, giving the professionals space to work, but their eyes stayed on the dog, whose heroic actions had brought them to this moment. As the paramedics lifted the boy onto a stretcher, the dog jumped up, its tail wagging anxiously. It followed closely, refusing to leave the boy's side. One of the paramedics paused, crouching down to pet the dog. "You're the reason he's going to be okay, aren't you?" she said softly, her voice filled with admiration. The passengers and the driver watched as the ambulance doors closed and the vehicle sped away into the night. The dog stayed behind for a moment, staring after it, before turning back to the group. Its job was done. The driver knelt down and gently stroked the dog's head. "You're incredible," he said, his voice thick with emotion. The passengers murmured their agreement, some wiping tears from their eyes. This wasn't just a dog, it was a hero, one whose instincts and loyalty had saved a life. As the bus prepared to head back to its route, the dog stayed behind, watching as the group boarded. The passengers couldn't stop talking about what they had just witnessed, their voices filled with awe and gratitude. One thing was certain, none of them would ever forget this night or the dog that had led them to save a life. As the bus pulled away from the scene, the passengers sat in a reflective silence, their minds replaying the extraordinary events they had just witnessed. The atmosphere inside the vehicle was no longer filled with tension or curiosity, but a deep sense of gratitude and admiration. Everyone's thoughts were on the boy, how close he had come to being overlooked, and how a dog's determination had made the impossible possible. The driver's hands rested lightly on the wheel now, his grip relaxed for the first time that evening. He glanced in the rearview mirror, catching sight of the passengers. Some were quietly wiping away tears, others whispering to one another, their voices tinged with emotion. It wasn't just the boy's rescue that had moved them. It was the profound realization of how one moment, one choice, and one dog's unwavering loyalty could bring a group of strangers together for something so meaningful. One woman sitting near the front spoke softly, breaking the quiet. "I can't stop thinking about that dog," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "It didn't give up. It stayed by that boy's side, waiting for help. How many animals would do that?" An older man nodded, his expression solemn. "That wasn't just instinct," he said. "That dog had a heart. It knew that boy needed saving, and it did everything it could to make sure someone found him. We're lucky to have been part of it." The young woman, who had been the first to speak up earlier in the ride, now leaned forward, her eyes shining with tears. "It's incredible to think how close we came to missing all of this," she said. If the driver hadn't stopped, if we hadn't followed the dog, that boy might still be out there, all alone. She paused, her voice breaking. It's a reminder, isn't it? Sometimes we need to trust our instincts, even when it doesn't make sense. The driver felt a lump rise in his throat as he listened to their words. He thought back to the moment he'd first seen the dog, standing in the middle of the road, barking at the bus. How easy it would have been to ignore it, to dismiss it as just another stray. But something about that dog's eyes, its urgency, its determination, had convinced him to take a chance. And now, as he thought about the boy being cared for by paramedics, he knew he'd made the right decision. One of the passengers, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, turned toward the driver. "Thank you," she said, her voice carrying through the quiet. "For stopping, for trusting that dog. You didn't just save that boy tonight. You reminded all of us that there's still good in this world." The driver nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "I didn't do it alone," he said after a moment. "We all made that choice together. And the real hero, well, it's the one who wouldn't take no for an answer." The passengers smiled at his words, their thoughts returning to the dog. It was almost surreal to think about how it had all unfolded. The dog appearing out of nowhere, leading them down streets and paths, never faltering until it brought them to the boy. It was a story that felt too incredible to be true, yet they had all lived it. As the bus continued its journey, the passengers began to open up to one another in ways they hadn't before. Strangers shared their thoughts and feelings, bonding over the shared experience. Some recounted stories of other animals they'd known with a remarkable sense of intuition or loyalty, while others simply marveled at the sheer improbability of the night's events. "Do you think the boy will be okay?" someone asked, their voice tinged with worry. The nurse, who had stayed quiet since the boy was taken into the ambulance, finally spoke up. "I think he will be," she said. "He was weak, but we got to him in time, and that's all thanks to that dog. If it hadn't stayed with him, barking for help, who knows what might have happened." Her words seemed to reassure everyone, and the mood in the bus shifted again, this time to one of hope. The passengers knew they might never know the full story of the boy or the dog, but they took comfort in the fact that they had been part of something bigger than themselves. The driver glanced out the window as the bus approached the final stop. The night was calm now, the chaos of earlier replaced by a serene stillness. As the passengers prepared to disembark, many of them paused to thank the driver personally, their words heartfelt. "Take care," one man said, patting the driver on the shoulder. "And thank you for showing us what it means to listen, to a dog, to our instincts, to each other." The driver smiled, nodding as the man exited. One by one, the passengers filed out, their faces marked with a quiet sense of peace. As the bus emptied, the driver sat alone for a moment, the events of the night finally sinking in. He couldn't stop thinking about the dog, its bravery, its persistence, and the way it had brought them all together. Turning off the engine, the driver leaned back in his seat and let out a deep breath. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he felt certain of one thing. This night would stay with him forever. The dog, the boy, the passengers. It was a story that deserved to be remembered, not just for what had happened, but for the lessons it had taught them all about compassion, trust, and the incredible bond between humans and animals. Somewhere out there, he thought, that dog was probably resting now, knowing it had done its job. And the boy? He was safe, alive, and with a future ahead of him. All thanks to the persistence of one extraordinary animal. And with that thought, the driver started the bus again, ready to carry forward, forever changed by the events of the night. As the extraordinary night drew to a close, the passengers of the bus and the driver found themselves reflecting on an experience that none of them could have predicted. It wasn't just an incredible story, they had lived it, witnessed the courage of a dog, the resilience of a young boy, and the power of a shared decision to trust the unknown. Now, it was time to bring this journey to a close, but the lessons from it would remain etched in their hearts forever. The driver pulled into the station, the hum of the engine fading as he turned it off. He sat there for a moment, staring at the empty seats in the rearview mirror. Each one of those seats had carried someone who would go home tonight and tell their family, their friends, or maybe even strangers about the dog that refused to give up until it saved a life. It was more than just an event. It was a moment of connection, of purpose, and of hope in a world that often feels chaotic and unpredictable. As he stepped off the bus, the cool night air hit him, and he took a deep breath. The image of the dog's determined eyes flashed in his mind, followed by the boy's fragile body lying in the grass. He thought about the passengers, how they had gone from strangers to a group united by one common goal: helping. Tonight had reminded him that even in the most unexpected circumstances, humanity could come together, inspired by something as simple yet profound as a dog's loyalty and love. And isn't that something worth sharing? Worth remembering? To those watching this video, think about the power of instinct, trust, and taking a chance. That dog wasn't just barking for attention. It was calling for help, calling for action, and it didn't give up until someone listened. It reminds us that sometimes the smallest voices, the ones we might overlook or dismiss, carry the most important messages. But this story isn't just about the dog or the boy. It's about all of us. What would you do in a moment like that? Would you trust your gut, even if it seems strange or inconvenient? Would you pause to listen, to act, to care? This experience is a reminder that small decisions, like stopping a bus or following a stray dog, can change lives in ways we can't imagine. And now, it's up to you. Stories like this one need to be shared, not just for the sake of the story itself, but for the lessons they carry. Let this tale of bravery, compassion, and trust inspire others to look a little closer, to listen a little more carefully, and to act when the moment calls for it. If this story moved you, take a moment to share it with someone who might need to hear it. Click the like button to let us know you were inspired, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that show the extraordinary in the everyday. And if you've ever witnessed or experienced something similar, leave a comment below. We'd love to hear your story. Let's spread this message together, a reminder of the good in the world and the bond between humans and animals. Because sometimes, a bark is more than just a bark. Sometimes, it's a call to be the hero someone else needs. Thank you for watching, and remember, even the smallest acts of kindness, the smallest decisions to stop and listen, can create ripples that change lives. Stay curious, stay compassionate, and always be ready to follow the unexpected. Who knows? The next time you stop and listen, you just might save a life.